In the blistering summer heat of 1353 BC, as the golden light of the Egyptian sun spread across the Nile Valley, the future pharaoh Akhenaten stepped into a world already trembling beneath political tension, religious evolution, and dynastic fragility. This was a moment when Egypt, the wealthiest empire in the ancient world, stood at the pinnacle of its glory, yet was internally fractured by hidden rivalries, priestly power struggles, and the question of royal blood purity. It was within this turbulent era that a forbidden story would emerge, a story that would shock later archaeologists and historians, the possibility that a pharaoh married his own daughters to preserve his divine authority. To understand how such a union could happen, one must first understand the world that shaped Akhenaten. Born as Amenhotep Roman IV, he was the second son of Pharaoh Amenhotep Roman III, one of the greatest rulers of the 18th dynasty. Egypt at this time was a civilization built on divine kingship. The pharaoh was not merely a ruler. He was believed to be a living representative of the gods, particularly of Horus on earth and later Osiris in the afterlife. His blood was considered sacred, untouchable, and unmatched in purity. Marrying within the royal family was not only acceptable but often encouraged. Sisters married brothers. Aunts married nephews. Occasionally, a father might even elevate a daughter to the role of great royal wife. Yet even within this environment, what Akhenaten would eventually do pushed against the limits of Egyptian tradition. From his earliest years, Akhenaten was a strange presence in the palace. Depictions of him from later reigns show elongated limbs, wide hips, narrow faces, and feminine features. Many scholars believe these images were symbolic rather than literal, meant to represent his spiritual transformation rather than physical reality. Still, the figure that emerges from historical sources is unmistakably different from the proud, muscular kings who preceded him. Where Amenhotep Roman III embraced the old gods and the lavish ceremonies of Amun's priesthood, Akhenaten turned inward, obsessed with one deity above all others, the Aten, the radiant sun disk, whose rays extended down like fingers offering life to the earth. When Akhenaten ascended the throne around 1353 BC, the priesthood of Amun was at its peak, controlling vast lands, wealth, and political power. Egypt was being ruled not just from the palace, but from the temples. This influence deeply troubled the young pharaoh. To him, the worship of Amun had become corrupt and bloated. The old gods were intertwined with powerful elites who could challenge the throne. Akhenaten began to imagine a new world, one where the king alone stood between the divine and mankind. This vision would eventually lead to one of the greatest religious revolutions in history. Before his radical reforms took shape, Akhenaten solidified the royal household through marriage. He wed the legendary Queen Nefertiti, a woman of unparalleled beauty, intelligence, and political savvy. Together, they quickly became the most striking royal couple Egypt had ever seen. Their images appeared everywhere, Nefertiti standing beside the pharaoh, often as his equal, sometimes even taking on roles traditionally reserved for kings. The early years of their reign were marked by fertility and abundance. Nefertiti bore several daughters, each celebrated as a living symbol of divine favor. But even during these prosperous times, something darker stirred beneath the surface. Akhenaten's devotion to Aten grew more intense, more consuming. The old temples were stripped of wealth. The worship of Amun was slowly silenced. Statues of the god were removed or destroyed, and the pharaoh began redirecting Egypt's wealth toward the construction of a brand new capital, Akhenaten, the horizon of the Aten. This city, carved from the desert sands, was intended to be a physical embodiment of the new religion. Here, Akhenaten could rule without the interference of the old priesthood. Here, Aten alone would shine. For the royal family, this move brought isolation. In their desert capital, far from Memphis and Thebes, the pharaoh's daughters became the center of court life. They accompanied their parents everywhere: political meetings, religious ceremonies, military parades. The walls of Akhenaten depict them in loving detail, playing with their mother, sitting on their father's lap, running beneath the rays of Aten. No other Egyptian pharaoh left behind so many intimate and affectionate depictions of his children. Yet this closeness, while charming on the surface, carried a deeper implication. With Akhenaten turning away from the old ruling elites and distancing himself from powerful royal relatives, the daughters became the only direct vessels of the pharaoh's divine blood. And in the ideology Akhenaten created, the king was not simply chosen by Aten. He was Aten's earthly reflection. To preserve this purity, marriage within the family became more than tradition. It became a necessity. By the time Akhenaten's religious revolution reached its full power, Nefertiti had seemingly vanished from historical records. Some scholars believe she died. Others believe she was moved away from political life. A smaller group suggests she may have taken on a new royal identity. Whatever the truth, her disappearance left a vacuum. And in this vacuum emerged the most controversial question surrounding Akhenaten's reign. Did he marry one, possibly even two, of his own daughters? The strongest candidate is his daughter Meritaten, the eldest child. In several inscriptions, she appears with titles normally reserved for queens, including Great Royal Wife. Another daughter, Akhenaten, would later marry her half-brother Tutankhaten, who became the famous King Tut. But some sources indicate she may have first served as royal consort to her father. If true, these unions were not romantic in the modern sense. They were political and divine. To Akhenaten, no woman outside his own bloodline was worthy of bearing the future children of the living son. His reforms had cut off the old noble families. Marriage alliances meant nothing to him now. Only the daughters he believed were born from the Aten's favor could serve as his partners in ritual. As the sun continued to rise over Akhenaten, the royal daughters grew not merely as children of a king, but as potential queens, successors, and divine vessels. The world outside saw this as shocking, horrifying, and unnatural. But inside the palace walls, this was the new order. A pharaoh who believed himself chosen by the sun could break any rule, bend any tradition, and reshape the world according to his vision. Yet this forbidden union would not bring stability. Instead, it marked the beginning of the collapse of Akhenaten's fragile empire. His religious obsession, his isolation from traditional power structures, and his controversial royal marriages would eventually ignite a crisis that rippled through Egypt long after his death. And as the sun set behind the cliffs of Akhenaten each evening, the shadows grew longer, hinting at a future where this revolution would unravel, revealing its darkest secrets. When Akhenaten moved the royal court to the barren cliffs of Middle Egypt around 1346 BC, the world of the pharaoh changed forever. What he built there, in the blinding heat and open desert, was unlike anything Egypt had ever seen. This new city, Akhenaten, was not carved from ancient traditions, but from the mind of a king who believed himself chosen by the sun. And within its sunlit walls, rituals, relationships, and royal decisions unfolded that would define one of the strangest chapters in Egyptian history. It was here that the whispers of forbidden unions grew louder. Akhenaten rose from the sand with astonishing speed. Thousands of workers, artisans, priests loyal to Aten, and members of the royal court relocated from Thebes. The sudden migration was a shock to the empire. Powerful nobles resented the move, priests of Amun raged silently behind closed temple doors, and soldiers grumbled about leaving the old capital. But Akhenaten was unmoved. The sun god had spoken through visions and omens, and the pharaoh believed he was walking the path of destiny. Unlike the towering temples of Thebes where shadows dominated vast halls, the temples of Akhenaten were open-air sanctuaries exposed to constant sunlight. No roofs, no darkness, no secret chambers. The Aten, the radiant sun disk, demanded openness. Every ritual was performed under the naked sky. Priests lifted offerings to the sun. The royal family appeared constantly in public ceremonies. their faces illuminated by Aten's rays carved on every wall. Depictions from the city show a remarkable intimacy, Akhenaten holding his daughters, kissing them, lifting them onto his lap. These images are unusual in Egyptian art, which traditionally depicted pharaohs as distant, stoic, and untouchable. But Akhenaten wanted to show the world a new type of divinity, one rooted in family bonds. His daughters were not ornaments, they were extensions of his soul, proof that Aten blessed his bloodline. The daughters grew in prominence. Nefertiti, the eldest, gained titles indicating she performed royal duties. Akhenaten, the second, was shown beside her father in rituals usually reserved for queens. Akhenaten, the third, would later play a vital political role long after her father's death. Their presence was everywhere. Court officials bowed to them, scribes recorded their movements, and artists carved their images into the city walls with meticulous detail. But beneath this carefully presented image, a darker truth began to take shape. Letters from foreign rulers, especially from the Amarna diplomatic archives, reveal a growing unease among Egypt's allies. They were confused by Akhenaten's isolation. Why did he refuse to meet foreign envoys? Why did he ignore urgent pleas for military support? Why were traditional alliances being weakened or abandoned? Many suspected that the pharaoh had become consumed by his new religion, allowing politics and war to slip through his fingers. The most powerful families of Egypt, meanwhile, watched from afar as the king pulled the royal household deeper into isolation. Marriage alliances with other noble houses were no longer being arranged. Princesses, once essential for securing political bonds, were now kept inside Akhenaten, appearing only during religious ceremonies. And this secrecy gave rise to one of history's most controversial possibilities, that Akhenaten intended to marry his own daughters to maintain the sacred purity of his lineage. Evidence for this is found not through a single inscription, but through patterns in royal titles, sudden shifts in hierarchy, and depictions suggesting the daughters stepped into roles typically reserved for great royal wives. Nefertiti, for instance, begins appearing with titles that suggest she served as queen after Nefertiti's disappearance. These titles were not honorary. Only a true consort to the pharaoh could bear them. And in Egypt's royal ideology, the consort of a divine king needed to share divine blood. This made daughters uniquely suitable. At the same time, the disappearance of Nefertiti remains one of the great mysteries of the Amarna period. One moment she was standing as the most powerful woman in Egypt. The next, she vanished from the records. Did she die suddenly? Did she fall from political favor? Did she assume another identity entirely? Whatever the truth, her absence left a void in the role of great royal wife. Into this void stepped Nefertiti. The palace scribes began recording her attending rituals alongside her father. She appears wearing the royal crown traditionally associated with queens. Some scenes even depict her performing religious duties only a royal consort would carry out. Her prominence rises sharply, too sharply to be ignored. Egyptologists studying the Amarna tomb inscriptions noticed that Nefertiti's titles shift from royal daughter to great royal wife in a span of only a few years. This change aligns with periods when Akhenaten's need for a queen to validate his divine image intensified. Then there is the tragic story of Akhenaten. In one of the most emotional depictions from the period, a mourning scene carved inside the royal tomb shows Akhenaten and Nefertiti grieving over a young girl's death, believed by many to be Akhenaten. What startled researchers was another figure present in the depiction, a woman giving birth protected by divine beings. This scene led some scholars to propose a troubling theory. Was Akhenaten pregnant at the time of her death? And if so, who could have fathered the child in a city where royal bloodlines were tightly controlled? The possibility that the father could have been Akhenaten himself sparked debates across the archaeological world. Some dismiss it. Others argue that the palace environment, religious ideology, and sudden rise of the daughters make the theory plausible. While definitive proof is lacking, the circumstantial evidence is powerful enough to keep the debate alive. Inside Akhenaten, life continued to revolve around the unwavering devotion to Aten. Every day began with the rising sun, marked by musical hymns composed by Akhenaten himself. The hymn to the Aten, one of the most poetic works of ancient Egyptian literature, describes the sun as the sole creator, the giver of life, the source of all power. This hymn replaced the prayers of old, pushing aside centuries of tradition. Even children were taught that Aten alone ruled the world. But while Akhenaten focused on religion, the outer provinces of Egypt began to suffer. Enemies took advantage of Egypt's distraction. The Hittites expanded their power in the north. Rebellions erupted in Syria and Canaan. Egypt's once feared military now faced disorder due to lack of leadership. Yet in Akhenaten, these crises seemed distant, overshadowed by rituals, family ceremonies, and the continued shaping of a new divine identity centered on the pharaoh and his daughters. The daughters themselves responded differently to this unusual world. Nefertiti embraced her rising status. She walked behind her father in ceremonies with confidence. Akhenaten watched everything carefully, absorbing the political lessons that would later help her survive the chaos after her father's death. Nefertiti, however, remained the most tragic. Her fragile health, combined with her sudden disappearance from records, created haunting questions. Meanwhile, whispers spread among the workers and lower officials who served in Akhenaten. They spoke of rituals where the daughters stood beside Akhenaten in roles once reserved for mature queens. They spoke of the king's absolute conviction that only his own bloodline could sustain Aten's worship, and they spoke of royal decisions hidden from the public, decisions that would never appear in official carvings. As years passed, Akhenaten became not just a city, but a symbol of Akhenaten's isolation. The more he pushed away the traditions of old Egypt, the more he relied on his daughters to uphold his divine identity. They were no longer just children. They were the Sun King's companions, political assets, and possibly even queens. Yet beneath the bright sunlight of Aten, cracks were beginning to form. The empire outside was weakening. The court inside was becoming more fragile, and the decisions made in the royal household were setting Egypt on a path toward one of the most dramatic collapses in its history. Within the golden glow of the desert city, surrounded by walls carved with rays of the sun, the stage was being set for tragedy, rebellion, and the downfall of a dynasty built on divine obsession.
By 1339 BC, the golden glow of Aten that once bathed Akhenaten with divine promise had begun to dim. The city, once filled with the echo of hymns and celebratory rituals, had grown eerily quiet. Cracks appeared not only in its sandstone temples, but also in the political structure of the empire. Inside the palace walls, the royal daughters watched the shifting tides as the world their father built with unshakable conviction began to crumble. What happened next would forever change Egypt and cement the mysteries surrounding Akhenaten's forbidden unions. Akhenaten's religious revolution, once bold and uncompromising, was now straining under the weight of its own extremism. Egypt's nobles and priests, long suppressed by the dissolution of the Amun cult, were quietly regaining influence. Military commanders complained that pleas for reinforcements were being ignored. Foreign allies questioned whether the pharaoh had lost interest in diplomacy altogether. But Akhenaten remained focused on the one thing he believed mattered above all else, maintaining the divine bond between himself and Aten, and this divine connection was reflected in the closeness he shared with his daughters. Every morning, the royal family stood atop elevated platforms as the first light of the sun touched the horizon. Nefertiti often stood directly beside her father in the place previously occupied by Nefertiti. She now carried the title Great Royal Wife in several inscriptions. This was no minor designation. Historically, the Great Royal Wife served not only as the king's partner, but also as the symbolic mother of the nation, the chief priestess of key rituals, and the living representation of divine femininity. Her new title was not given lightly, nor could it be explained by ceremony alone. It suggested elevation to a role only a spouse could occupy. Inside the palace, servants whispered, some believed Meritaten had been married to her father to secure the sacred lineage. Others thought the marriage was symbolic, meant to fulfill religious imagery without implying physical union, but the inscriptions were clear. She acted as queen during the later years of Akhenaten's reign. And then came the tragedy that shook the royal household. Mekhetaten, the second daughter, vanished from public imagery shortly after a sequence of dramatic tomb scenes was carved into the royal necropolis. These scenes depicted a heartbreaking event, the death of a young royal woman. In the artwork, Akhenaten and Nefertiti stood beside her lifeless body, mourning deeply. Behind them, a mysterious figure of a woman surrounded by divine beings seemed to be giving birth. Egyptologists spent decades debating this image. Some believed Mekhetaten died in childbirth. Others argued the scene represented symbolic rebirth. But one interpretation unsettled historians more than all others. If Mekhetaten died in childbirth, who fathered the child? The palace at Akhenaten was heavily controlled. The daughters rarely left the royal environment. No foreign prince or nobleman is recorded as entering their inner circle. The most obvious, though controversial, possibility was Akhenaten himself. Whether this union was physical or symbolic remains unproven, but the silence of inscriptions and the abruptness of her disappearance left an unsettling gap in the historical record. After Mekhetaten's death, Meritaten's role grew even more dominant. She appeared in royal lists, temple inscriptions, and administrative records. Her presence beside the pharaoh became a political necessity as opposition to Atenism increased. She was not merely a daughter, she was his consort in religious ceremonies, his deputy in royal duties, and his symbol of continuity. Yet even as Meritaten rose, another figure began stepping into the light, Akhenaten. Akhenaten, younger but sharp-minded, had absorbed everything happening around her. She saw the political tension, the religious divide, and the growing anger among displaced priests. She understood that Akhenaten was becoming a fragile bubble. Her father's absolute devotion, once admirable, now felt dangerous. Her future, unlike her sister's, would depend on navigating whatever remained after the Sun King's eventual fall. The outside world continued to deteriorate. Egypt's vassal states sent desperate letters, rebellion spread. The Hittite Empire, growing in power, expanded into territories that once belonged firmly under Egyptian control, but Akhenaten refused to abandon his city. Retreating to Thebes or Memphis meant surrendering to the old gods. To him, that was unthinkable. Inside Akhenaten, frustration grew among officials who feared the kingdom was collapsing. Many began aligning themselves with emerging political figures, preparing for the inevitable change in leadership. Among these figures were generals, scribes, and a mysterious royal male who appeared late in Akhenaten's reign, Smenkhkare. Smenkkare's origins remain one of history's great puzzles. Some theories suggest he was Akhenaten's brother, others claim he was his son. A smaller group proposes he might have been Nefertiti under a new identity. But one fact is clear. Smenkhkare suddenly appears as a king or prince toward the end of Akhenaten's reign, and in several inscriptions he is shown married to Meritaten. This marriage could have been political, an attempt to transfer authority smoothly. Or it could have been an attempt to remove Meritaten from her role as queen to Akhenaten and reposition her as queen to the next ruler. Whatever the motive, Meritaten becomes linked to Smenkhkare and her role shifts accordingly. Then, around 1336 BC, Akhenaten died. His death shook Akhenaten to its core. Panic rippled through the city. Supporters of Atenism feared retaliation from traditionalists. Foreign allies wondered if Egypt still had a functioning government. And inside the palace, the royal daughters faced a world they were never prepared for. Smenkhkare ruled briefly, possibly only a year. Some believe he died unexpectedly. Others believe he was removed. But his disappearance is nearly as sudden as his arrival. Following him, the throne passed to the young Tutankhaten, likely a son of Akhenaten. He was only a child, and his rule depended heavily on the guidance of two powerful men, I, the Grand Vizier, and Horemheb, the military commander. Akhenaten soon married Tutankhaten, becoming queen and marking the final role of Akhenaten's daughters in Egypt's political transformation. As queen, she took on a symbolic task, guiding Egypt back to stability. And one of the first decisions of her council was monumental, abandoning Atenism. Tutankhaten changed his name to Tutankhamun, the temples of Aten were closed, the worship of Amun returned, Akhenaten was deserted. Statues of Akhenaten were defaced or destroyed. Royal records were rewritten to erase him from Egypt's memory. The daughters who once stood proudly under the rays of Aten were now surrounded by political chaos and religious vengeance. Meritaten's fate became uncertain. Meketaten remained a tragic memory. Akhenaten struggled to protect her young husband and the fragile kingdom, but even she could not escape the turmoil. After Tutankhamun's death, she attempted diplomatic negotiations with foreign powers, a rare act for an Egyptian queen. Yet these moves only deepened the political crises around her. By the time the dust settled, the once divine family of Akhenaten had been almost entirely erased from official history, but the secrets of their relationships, especially the controversial possibility of father-daughter unions, remained buried beneath the desert sands. Only centuries later, when archaeologists uncovered the Amarna letters, tomb scenes, and ruined temples, did the world begin piecing together the story, a story of religious obsession, political collapse, and a forbidden lineage that challenged even the boundaries of ancient Egyptian tradition. When Akhenaten's sun finally set in 1336, BC, Egypt stood fractured, wounded, and uncertain of its future. The grand experiment he had forced upon the empire, a radical monotheistic revolution centered on Aten, collapsed almost immediately after his death. Yet the legacy of his forbidden unions, the mysterious elevation of his daughters, and the devastating consequences of his rule continued to ripple through Egypt long after his desert city was abandoned. What followed was not merely a political transition, but a systematic erasure of a pharaoh who dared to break the ancient order. As soon as Akhenaten's body was laid to rest, likely in the royal tomb at Akhenaten, the remaining power structure scrambled to reorganize itself. Smenkhkare, the ephemeral ruler whose role remains one of the greatest puzzles in Egyptian history, held the throne briefly. Meritaten, once elevated to the status of great royal wife beside her father, now appeared as Smenkkare's queen. This shift reflected more than a marriage. It represented a strategic move to stabilize a collapsing dynasty. But Smenkhkare vanished almost as quickly as he appeared. His reign was too short to restore order or to secure legitimacy. Meritaten's fate after his disappearance is unknown. Her name flickers in a few late-period inscriptions but without clarity. Whether she remained in the royal palace, died young, or was forced into obscurity remains a mystery buried with the rest of the Amarna legacy. With Smenkhkare gone, the throne passed to a child, Tutankhaten. Barely 9 years old, he inherited a kingdom on the brink of rebellion. Around him stood powerful advisors, including I and Horemheb, both men intent on restoring Egypt to its former glory. And standing beside the young king was his half-sister Akhenaten, now his wife. Together they formed a symbolic bridge, a way to bind the remains of Akhenaten's bloodline with the restored traditions of the old gods. One of the first actions of Tutankhaten's court was monumental, the rejection of Atenism. The boy king, under the guidance of his advisors, changed his name from Tutankhaten to Tutankhamun, signaling a return to the worship of Amun. This name change alone was a political declaration. It represented a formal break with Akhenaten's revolution and a plea for the forgiveness of the priesthood, the nobility, and the gods themselves. Temples dedicated to Aten were closed, abandoned, or repurposed. Massive stone blocks from Akhenaten were transported back to Thebes and reused in the construction of Amun's temples. Sculptures of Akhenaten were smashed. His name was chiseled from inscriptions. His monuments were dismantled. Egypt attempted to wipe him from its memory, yet while his father's image was being erased, Tutankhamun struggled with the tremendous responsibility of ruling a divided nation. He was too young to steer Egypt alone. Akhenaten, now called Akhenaten after the religious restoration, took a more active role in the royal household. She served as a mediator between the world her father created and the traditions that were now returning. Her beauty, intelligence, and understanding of religious protocol made her a key figure in stabilizing the volatile transition. However, the legacy of Akhenaten's forbidden unions cast a long shadow over their reign. Many in the court whispered about the purity of the royal bloodline. Some believed that the incestuous marriages, whether real or symbolic, had weakened the family both spiritually and physically. These whispers gained strength when Tutankhamun's fragile health became increasingly apparent. Studies of his mummy centuries later revealed congenital issues that likely resulted from generations of intrafamily marriages. Whether Akhenaten's alleged unions with his daughters contributed remains uncertain, but the royal family's genetic vulnerabilities were undeniable. While Tutankhamun attempted to restore Egypt's military presence abroad, domestic politics remained fragile. The priesthood regained its power swiftly, nobles reclaimed lands and authority, and the memory of Akhenaten, though officially erased, lingered beneath the surface. Former supporters of the Aten faith struggled to survive in the newly restored order, while enemies of the Amarna regime sought revenge. In the midst of this instability, Tutankhamun died suddenly around 1323 BCE, likely at the age of 18 or 19. His death unleashed a political crisis unlike anything Egypt had seen in decades. He left no heir, and his widow Akhenaten found herself trapped in a dangerous vacuum of power. Desperate to protect her position and perhaps her life, Akhenaten took the unprecedented step of writing to the king of the Hittites, a long-standing rival of Egypt. In her letter, she pleaded for a foreign prince to come and marry her, promising to make him king of Egypt. This plea revealed several things: her fear of the powerful generals around her, her lack of trust in the remaining Egyptian nobility, and the extent to which royal women were at risk once their husbands died. The Hittite king agreed and sent his son, but the young prince never reached Egypt. He was assassinated at the border. Many believe Horemheb or I orchestrated the killing to prevent a foreign ruler from seizing Egypt's throne. Shortly afterward, I forced Akhenaten to marry him. This marriage was a political maneuver, not a union of affection. Afterward, she vanished from the historical record just as her mother Nefertiti had. Whether she died suddenly or was eliminated remains unknown. Her tragic fate marked the end of Akhenaten's bloodline holding power in Egypt. Following I's short reign, the throne passed to Horemheb, a military commander with no royal blood. He spent his rule reversing everything related to Akhenaten's legacy. He restored temples, strengthened the military, and rewrote official histories. His scribes removed Akhenaten, Smenkhkare, Tutankhamun, and I from king lists, as if none of them ever ruled. Horemheb positioned himself as the rightful heir to the great pharaohs before the Amarna period, marking the final stage of Egypt's attempt to erase the memory of the Sun King. Yet erasing history is never perfect. Centuries later, archaeologists uncovered the ruins of Akhenaten, the Amarna letters, and the tomb scenes that revealed the intimate and unusual dynamics of Akhenaten's royal household. These discoveries forced scholars to confront the uncomfortable truths of his reign, the radical reimagining of religion, the collapse of political order, and the possible marriages between the pharaoh and his daughters. The Amarna period remains one of the most fascinating and controversial eras in all of ancient history. It was a time when a king believed himself the chosen vessel of a single god, when royal bloodlines were guarded with extreme and possibly forbidden measures, and when the sun's glory cast shadows darker than any Egypt had known before. The consequences of Akhenaten's decisions, from religious upheaval to dynastic collapse, reshaped the trajectory of Egyptian civilization. Akhenaten's forbidden unions, whether literal or symbolic, were part of his broader vision of divine kingship. He believed his bloodline was sacred, touched by the radiant hands of Aten, and destined to carry the light of a single god into eternity. But instead of leading Egypt into a new golden age, his actions contributed to its greatest political crisis of the 18th dynasty. The story of the pharaoh who may have married his daughters is not merely a tale of forbidden relationships. It is the story of how absolute belief can blind rulers to the fragile realities of power. It is the story of how a king with divine ambition brought an empire to the edge of ruin. And it is the story of how history, no matter how deeply buried, always finds its way back to the surface.